He woke up at 6:15 in the morning, heart already moving. That low-grade alertness, the kind that used to mean emails to answer, a meeting to prep for, something to not be late to. He reached for his phone before his eyes were fully open. No new work emails. Because there was no work. He'd been retired for 2 months. His mind knew that. But his nervous system hadn't gotten the memo. It was still running the same program it had run for 35 years. Get up, get ready, get moving, stay useful. The body doesn't just take a day off from that. Not after decades. I've been close to that feeling. That strange first quiet of the morning, when there's nothing pulling at you, and somehow that feels worse than being buried in obligations. Like you're supposed to be somewhere, and you've already forgotten where. I used to call it corporate PTSD. Not in a dramatic way, just as an honest name for what it is. Your nervous system still bracing for impact, even after the storm is gone. You've stepped off the high-speed train, and your legs still expect the ground to be moving. The silence doesn't feel like freedom right away. It feels like forgetting something important. And that's the part nobody warns you about. Because the hard part of retirement isn't figuring out what to do with your time. The hard part is unlearning the reflex that says doing nothing means you're falling behind. There are 7 things that quietly disappear after you retire. Some of them you'll miss. Some of them, honestly, you won't. But one of them, if you're not careful, becomes a trap that does more damage to your financial plan than a bad market year ever could. If you're between 55 and 65 and you want an honest roadmap for navigating this season, not the highlight reel version, subscribe. We're going to work through this together. For most of your working life, your calendar was doing something quiet but powerful. It was making decisions for you. 8 a.m. meeting, noon lunch, 3 p.m. call, 5:30 commute home. You didn't have to figure out what the day meant. The structure told you. And inside that structure, you always knew where you stood. Busy meant valuable. Scheduled meant purposeful. Moving meant you were doing it right. Then retirement comes and the calendar goes blank. Not just lighter. Blank. And the first thing a lot of people feel isn't relief. It's a low hum of anxiety that doesn't have a name yet. Because for 30 or 40 years, empty time was something you fixed. You filled it. That was the responsible thing to do. I still remember sitting with a cup of tea at 10 on a Wednesday morning. The light was coming in. Nothing was on fire. By any reasonable measure, that was a good moment. But in my head, there was this voice. Decent. Responsible people are grinding right now. What exactly are you doing? That voice isn't weakness. It's a reflex. Decades of conditioning that tied your worth to your output. And here's where it gets complicated. A lot of people don't dismantle that reflex. They just redirect it. They start filling the days back up, not with things they actually want, but with things that feel productive enough to quiet the guilt. One woman, whose sister left a comment that stuck with me, chose to spend her weekends simply doing nothing. No plans, no obligations, no visits. Just rest. And her own sister mocked her for it, called it lazy, called it selfish. That's the social pressure that runs underneath all of this. The idea that if you're not producing something, if you can't answer, so, what are you up to these days? With a full list of activities, then you're wasting the gift of retirement. You're not. Your worth has never lived in how busy you kept yourself. You don't need to produce or perform to earn your place. That's not what these years are for. But the guilt is real, and it has a mechanism. When structure disappears, the brain experiences something close to low-grade withdrawal. Routine creates predictability, and predictability creates a sense of safety. Without it, the nervous system keeps scanning for what it's missing. That restlessness isn't a character flaw. It's biology catching up to a life change that happened faster than adaptation can move. The problem is what people do with that restlessness. Some people handle it well. They give themselves 6 to 12 months to decompress, resist the urge to immediately replace work with a packed agenda, and slowly let a new rhythm emerge. That rhythm usually ends up being quieter, more intentional, and more honest about what they actually enjoy. Other people can't sit with the discomfort long enough for that to happen, and that second group pays for it. Not just emotionally, financially. Because the discomfort drives spending. It drives decisions made from a place of proving something rather than wanting something. And that pattern, if you don't see it clearly, runs quietly in the background until it starts showing up in your account statements. If you can't unlearn the productivity guilt, you will spend your retirement in a kind of self-created tension, chasing the feeling of usefulness through obligations you never actually wanted. That is not what 40 years of work was supposed to buy you. The calendar was a tool, a useful one. But it was never the point. When the schedule disappears, something else disappears alongside it. And that second loss is the one most people don't see coming. There's a question nobody really prepares you for. Someone at a dinner party leans over and asks, "So, what do you do?" And for the first time in 35 years, you don't have a clean answer. Not because you've done nothing with your life, but because the thing that used to answer for that question automatically, the title, the company, the role, is gone. And you're standing there realizing how much of your identity was quietly living inside your job description. This is the third thing that goes quiet after retirement. And it hits harder than most people expect. Think about your closest work friendships. How many of them were built on proximity, not genuine connection? Same floor, same Slack channel, same Friday afternoon decompression ritual. You didn't choose each other exactly. Circumstance did. And circumstance kept you together. When the circumstance ends, most of those relationships don't survive the transition. Not because anyone did anything wrong, just because the shared context that held them together no longer exists. Your former colleagues are still inside the machine. You stepped out. And there's no easy way to stay connected across that divide. I've watched this happen to people who thought they were leaving with a full social life, only to realize 6 months in that their phone had gone mostly quiet. There was a VP I knew of, 30 years in senior leadership, the kind of person whose phone never stopped. Requests, updates, decisions, people needing him. That was the texture of his days. 6 months after he retired, he told someone he'd gone an entire week, where his longest conversation was 3 minutes with the guy at the grocery store. He wasn't mourning the salary. He was mourning the status. The feeling of being needed, of mattering to the forward motion of something larger than himself. That's not a small loss. And it's one that doesn't show up in any retirement planning spreadsheet. Because for decades, your job was doing 3 things simultaneously. It was giving you income. It was giving you structure. And it was giving you an identity you could hand to strangers in 10 seconds flat. Lose the job, you lose all 3 at once. The people who navigate this well don't wait for the old network to call. They understand clearly and without bitterness that proximity friendships have a natural lifespan. They were real, they mattered, and they were always partly situational. What those people do instead is build a different kind of connection. Slower, more intentional, chosen rather than assigned. A neighbor you actually get to know. A volunteer role where people remember your name because of what you bring, not what you're titled. A small group that meets around something you genuinely care about. That's the resilience path. The fragility path is waiting, checking your phone for messages, from people who are still buried in quarterly reviews and performance cycles. Holding on to a version of yourself that was real but is no longer the whole picture. If you stay on the fragility path long enough, the loneliness compounds. And loneliness in retirement isn't just uncomfortable. Research out of Harvard's study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies on human well-being, has found that social isolation in later life carries health consequences comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The identity crisis and the isolation aren't soft problems. They have hard downstream costs. You are more than what you were called at the office. That's not a consolation. It's just true. But here's what matters for where we're going next. The emptiness that comes from losing structure, losing your work friendships, and losing your professional identity, that combination creates a specific kind of vulnerability. And that vulnerability has a financial consequence that most people never see until it's already done the damage. So what happens when the emptiness wins? When the identity is gone, the schedule is blank, and the phone stays quiet long enough that the discomfort becomes unbearable. Most people don't sit with it. They fix it, or at least they try to fix it the fastest way they know how. They get busy, not the kind of busy that comes from genuine desire. The kind that comes from needing to have an answer when someone asks what you've been up to. The kind that looks like purpose from the outside but feels hollow from the inside. I've seen people take on part-time work they actively disliked, not for the income, but for the structure, for somewhere to be at 9 a.m., for a reason to get dressed. I've watched grandparents volunteer for full-time childcare arrangements they never agreed to, not because they didn't love their grandchildren, but because saying yes felt easier than explaining that they needed time for themselves. And then, 18 months in, they were exhausted, quietly resentful, and still not any clearer on who they were outside of being useful to someone else. And then there's the version that does the most financial damage. The spending. A man, 62 years old, had done everything reasonably right, saved consistently, retired with a solid portfolio. But about 8 months in, the restlessness got loud. He bought a boat. Not because he had a lifelong passion for being on the water. Because a boat was something to talk about, something to show. A hobby that announced itself at dinner parties so he didn't have to explain the blank space where his career used to be. Then came the golf club membership. Then the upgrades he hadn't planned for. None of it made him feel better for long. That's the thing about spending driven by emotional need rather than genuine want. The relief is temporary, so you spend again. Researchers studying retirement behavior call this boredom spending, and it's more common and more expensive than most people realize. Here's what the math looks like in 2026. According to Northwestern Mutual's 2026 research, Americans believe they need $1,460,000 to retire comfortably. The actual median savings for people aged 55 to 64 is $537,560. That gap is already significant. Now add undisciplined spending on top of it. Say you retire with $500,000 in your portfolio. That's not an unusual number, and it's not a hopeless one if managed carefully. But if emotional restlessness drives you to spend an extra $50 a day, just $50, coffee runs, impulse purchases, subscriptions, club memberships you feel obligated to maintain, that adds up to $1,500 a month, $18,000 a year. In a 2026 inflation environment running at 2.8%, that unplanned drain doesn't just cost you $18,000. It costs you the compound growth that money would have generated, and it accelerates the timeline on which your portfolio runs thin. Run that out 10 years, and you're not looking at a comfortable adjustment. You're looking at real asset depletion before you reach 75. That's not a worst-case scenario designed to frighten you. That's arithmetic. The trap of forced busyness isn't just about time or energy. It's about what you spend to buy the feeling of being occupied. Every dollar that goes toward manufacturing a sense of purpose is a dollar that stops working for you. And the cruel part is that it doesn't solve the underlying problem. The status doesn't come back. The identity doesn't return. You just have less money and the same quiet. So buying busyness with your portfolio is a trade you can only make once. You don't get to undo it at 78. The question then is a real one. If the old kind of ambition is gone and filling the void with spending is off the table, where does the energy actually go? Here's what doesn't retire when you do. Your brain. Specifically, the part of your brain that likes to figure things out. The part that ran the numbers before anyone else in the room. That tracked the details, spotted the gap, found the angle nobody had considered yet. That didn't clock out on your last day. It's still there. It just doesn't have a game to play anymore. That's actually the opening. I used to think retirement meant stepping back from all of it, handing the wheel over to a financial advisor, and letting the market do whatever it was going to do. I was wrong about that. Completely wrong. Because it turns out that the years between 60 and 65 aren't the finish line of your financial life. They're the window where the most consequential optimization decisions actually happen. The ones that determine how much of what you've built you actually get to keep. And getting to keep more of it turns out to be a genuinely interesting problem. One that rewards exactly the kind of analytical energy that used to go into hitting quarterly targets. Think about a former sales executive. For 28 years, the game was closing. Beating the number. Finding the edge. That competitive instinct doesn't evaporate at 62. What changes is that there's no longer a leaderboard at work to measure it against. But there is a new leaderboard, and the opponent is the IRS. That reframe matters more than it sounds. Because instead of channeling ambition into obligations you resent or purchases you don't need, you channel it into something that has a direct, measurable return. Understanding the rules of the financial system in the year you're actually living in, and using them to protect what you've spent 4 decades building. In 2026, one of the sharpest tools available sits inside a rule most people in their early 60s have never heard of. The Secure 2.0 Act introduced what the IRS calls the Super Catch-Up Contribution. If you are between the ages of 60 and 63, your standard 401k contribution limit in 2026 is $24,500. But the Super Catch-Up provision allows you to contribute an additional $11,250. On top of that, bringing your total annual personal contribution ceiling to $35,750. Let that land for a second. If you are in that age window right now and still working, you have access to a legal contribution limit that most of your colleagues don't even know exists. Every dollar you push into that account reduces your taxable income today or grows tax sheltered for tomorrow, depending on which bucket it goes into. Which brings up the detail that actually requires attention in 2026. If your prior year income exceeded $150,000, the IRS now requires that your super catch-up contributions go specifically into a Roth 401k, meaning after-tax dollars, not pre-tax. That's a meaningful distinction. It changes your tax calculation for this year, and it changes the character of your withdrawals in retirement. Getting it wrong doesn't just cost you a penalty. It costs you the strategic advantage you were trying to capture in the first place. This is the kind of thing that rewards people who are still paying attention. Run the math on what maximizing that contribution for just 3 years means. At a conservative 6% annual return, the additional $33,750 in catch-up contributions, compounded over 20 years, becomes something your financial advisor will find genuinely worth discussing. More importantly, the tax efficiency of those dollars in a Roth structure means your heirs see more of it too. That's not abstract, that's the game. And here's what I've found to be true. People who redirect their ambition into this kind of optimization don't miss the old ambition the way they expected to. Because this delivers something the corporate ladder rarely did. A win that belongs entirely to you and your family. No performance review, no manager to impress, no quarter-end pressure. Just a smarter number on the other side of a decision you made because you understood the rules better than most. When you know where to put your energy, the quiet of retirement stops being a void. It starts feeling like something you actually earned. Let's come back to where we started. A man at 6:15 in the morning, heart already moving, reaching for a phone out of pure reflex. Nervous system still braced for a world that no longer requires that from him. That moment is not a malfunction. It's the beginning of an adjustment that nobody talks about, honestly. Because it doesn't fit the postcard version of retirement. The one with the beach chair and the permanent smile. The real version is more interesting than that. And harder. You lose the schedule that told you who you were each day. You lose the proximity relationships that felt like friendship, but were partly just geography. You lose the title that answered the dinner party question before you had to think about it. And if you're not careful, you fill all of that empty space with busyness you don't actually want and spending that doesn't actually help. But here's what the losing also does. It clears the room. Everything that retires with you, the mandatory meetings, the obligations you tolerated, the relationships that were more performance than connection, none of that was the real you anyway. It was the scaffolding. And scaffolding is supposed to come down when the building is done. What's left is the part worth keeping. I'll be honest with you. There are still afternoons where I sit down and feel completely useless, where the voice comes back and tells me that a person of value would be doing something right now. I'm still learning how to let that pass without arguing with it, still learning how to sit in the quiet without grading myself, but I know we're pointed in the right direction. And I think you do too. The future in this season belongs to people who can stop performing busyness and start building something quieter and more honest. A rhythm that belongs to them. A morning with no alarm. An afternoon with no agenda. A financial plan that actually reflects what they want the next 20 years to look like, not what looks responsible from the outside. You worked for a long time to buy this. All of it. The time, the freedom, the option to wake up and decide what the day is actually for. That's not laziness. That's the return on investment. If this video helped you name something that's been sitting in the background without a label, share it with someone who's navigating the same transition. They probably need to hear it more than they've let on. And if you want to keep building a retirement strategy that's grounded in what 2026 actually looks like, not what the generic advice columns say, subscribe to Wes Investor. We'll keep working through this together. Take care of yourself. See you in the next one.